Dear students, welcome to the course of Architectural Studies for Engineers. This is lecture number 22. I am your teacher Ravinder Kumar Khyani, Assistant Professor, Department of Architecture and Planning, NLD University of Engineering and Technology, Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan. As you know that we are discussing the theme number 3, linkage with construction engineering, in which the topic architectural restoration and conservation, its impact on construction is under discussion. We have begun this topic in last class. Today we will continue with this topic. Architectural restoration and conservation and its impact on construction. Last time we have discussed about the restoration and building restoration, and today we are going to discuss about the conservation and architectural conservation and its impact on construction. So what is architectural conservation? Architectural conservation is the process of carefully planned interventions through which material, historical, and design integrity of any built heritage is prolonged. The individual engaged in this pursuit is known as an architectural conservator or restorator, whether he is an architect or construction engineer or a civil engineer for that matter. When and how to engage in conservation, restoration planning are critical decisions for protection of cultural heritage or architectural conservation. Ultimately, the value-based decisions are taken, which are usually based on the combination of artistic, contextual, and informational values. In some cases, a decision of not to be intervened may be the most appropriate choice. So in architectural conservation, it is very important that the building which we are going to conserve must have an artistic value, a contextual value, or an informational value. And if possible, we should not change anything within the building, but keep it intact as it is existing. There are two broad perspectives of architectural conservation. That is technical professional definitions and scope of architectural conservation. By narrow definition of architectural conservation, it is referred to as the professional combined use of science, art, craft, and technology as a preservation tool that deal with issues of prolonging the life and preserving the integrity of a building's architectural character, such as a form and style and its constituent materials such as stone, brick, glass, metal, and wood. Continuing with the definition of architectural conservation, by broad definition, architectural conservation referred to as the technical and professional combined use of design, art, and science to issues of identification, policy, regulation, and advocacy associated with the entirety of the cultural and built environment. And this broad scope of architectural conservation recognizes that society has mechanisms to identify and value the historic cultural resources and create laws to protect these resources and develop policies and management plans for their interpretation, protection, and education. So architectural conservation is not only the building conservation, but it is the recognition of cultural resources, protection of cultural resources, developing policies for architectural conservation, and management plan for architectural conservation, and interpretation of the buildings, their nature, their character, the protection of the building, and education about the building conservation processes as well as buildings values. Typically, the architectural conservation process operates as a specialized aspect of a society's planning system, and its practitioners are termed built or historic environment conservation professionals. So you can see that the architectural conservation gives a new direction to the professional practice of architects and construction engineers. The functional definition of architectural conservation narrates that architectural conservation is the process by which individuals or groups attempt to protect valued buildings from unwanted change. Because usually people change building and affect building in numerous ways. So protection of the building is the main concern of architectural conservation. Let's look at the history of architectural conservation movement. Why the architectural conservation is so important. Why architectural conservation came into existence. And why there is a movement of the architectural conservation around the world. As a movement, architectural conservation in general and the preservation of ancient structures specifically gained momentum during the 18th and the 19th centuries because of the technological improvements and advancement in the industry, which has affected the built environment and the old buildings of the world. Now, it was a response to modernism and its corresponding architectural perspective, which skewed the sentimental attachment of people to old buildings and structures in favor of technological and architectural progress and change. And this change is not always good because the buildings which were made are more unnatural materials and of a character that is not suitable for the environment. Well, prior to this time, most of the ancient buildings that were still standing had only survived because they have either had a significant cultural or religious impact or they had yet to be discovered. So there were different qualities in the old architecture which we have to understand. The growth of architectural conservation movement took place at a time of a significant archaeological discovery and scientific advancement because many old archaeological discoveries have taken place and old culture was discovered. Those educated in field of architectural conservation began to see various examples of architecture as either being correct or incorrect. Because of this, two schools of thoughts began to emerge within the field of building conservation and architectural conservation. And these two different schools of thoughts are the preservation of the architectural monument or conservation and restoration of the architectural monument. Looking at the history of architectural conservation movement, we can see that the preservation and conservation were the terms used interchangeably to refer to the architectural school of thought that either encourage measures that would protect and maintain buildings in their current state or would prevent further damage and deterioration to them. So the architects basically wanted that whatever creation they have made, the buildings that they have made, or the earlier architects, whatever buildings they have made must be remain intact, and there should not be any damage or deterioration. And that deterioration that happens over the period of time must be conserved or preserved. This school of thought saw the original design of old buildings as being correct of themselves. So this is the correct practice that the old structure should remain intact. The main proponent of the preservation and conservation movement in the 19th century were the art critic John Ruskin and the artist William Morris. On the other hand, the Restoration was the conservationist school of thought that believed that the historic buildings could be improved and sometimes even completed using the current day materials, designs, and techniques. So these two schools of thought always have the competition. Either we preserve or conserve, or we restore and progress. In this way, it is very similar to the modernist architectural theory, except it does not advocate the destruction of ancient structures, because ancient structures are made with quite a skillful manner by the old architects. One of the most ardent supporters of this school of thought in the 19th century was the French architect Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. Now let's look at the current treatments that are taking place in architectural conservation. The architectural conservation and preservation place a high premium on the retention of all historic fabric in a building through conservation, maintenance, and repair. It reflects a building's continuum over time through successive occupancies and the respectful changes and alterations that are made. So, old should also be protected and new should also be added. The rehabilitation emphasizes the retention and repair of historic materials, but more latitude is provided for replacement because it is assumed the property is more deteriorated prior to the work. So both preservation and rehabilitation standards focus attention on the preservation of those materials, features, finishes, spaces, and spatial relationships of the building or architecture that together give a property or architecture its historic character. So these are the two main treatments in architectural conservation. Then the third treatment is restoration, which focuses on the retention of materials from the most significant time in a property's history. So when the building is of more use, when the people were using it efficiently, so that efficient time of the building should be preserved while permitting the removal of materials from other periods and adding some new features for the adaptive reuse of the building. So restoration not only protect the building but also it create a kind of improvement in the building. Then the fourth treatment in architectural conservation is the reconstruction. The reconstruction establishes limited opportunities to recreate or non-surviving site or non-surviving building or an old building which is quite dilapidated and about to fall down. So landscape, sometimes landscape cannot be recreated or building cannot be recreated or the building cannot be protected or landscape cannot be protected. So in that case, a reconstruction is offered. A reconstruction includes the landscape, the building, the structure and object with all new materials, but keeping the characteristics of the old-fashioned style architecture. Now let's look at some architectural conservation and preservation problems and issues that usually occur or emerge in the buildings. The earliest building materials used by ancient people was wood and mud because these were the organic materials available in abundance. The organic materials was used because they were plentiful and they were also renewable. One can have abundance of this material and they can use it again and again. Unfortunately, the organic materials or natural materials used were also very susceptible to the two most significant impediments to preservation and conservation, and that is the elements and the life. What happens is that over time, inorganic materials like brick, stone, metal, concrete, and terracotta began to be used by ancient people instead of organic materials due to their durability. So durability become a criteria for building structures. The ancient buildings such as Egyptian pyramids, Roman Colosseum, and Parthenon face common preservation issues or restoration issues. The most prominent factors affecting these structures are the environment, the pollution, and the tourism that is taking place by visiting of the people to these historic cultural monuments. As Earth's climate pattern changes, so too the environmental conditions governing these buildings. So the changing climate increases the accumulation of salt crystals on the outside of these architectural monuments. And this phenomena increases the deterioration of these buildings. So this is the main, you can say, architectural conservation and preservation problem and issue. Furthermore, the salt crystals further contribute to the black effect that man-made pollution has on these buildings, because we have now transportation and vehicles, and there emerge a pollution, the air pollution, which also affect the buildings and make it black. The pollution from corrosive agents in their air has also attributed to this deterioration of the architectural monuments of historic significance. The third factor affecting the ancient buildings or old building conservation is tourism, because people who are visiting these buildings do not take much care of what they are doing. While tourism provides both economical and cultural benefit of the architectural conservation, it can also be a destructive practice. For example, the pyramids in Giza have also encountered problems due to large numbers of tourists, and most tourists mean greater humidity and water presence, which led to the erosion of the building. So all of the above factors complicate the conservation options available to treatment of these historical monuments and cultural buildings. Now let's look at the architectural conservation process. The architectural conservation process consists of two steps. One is assessment and other is treatment. Let's talk about the architectural conservation assessments. The first step in any architectural conservation project is a sensitive assessment of its history and merits. A knowledge of the whole life of a building brings an essential understanding of its features and its problems over the period of time. Once the assessment of the building or a structure is complete, the next step is a thorough measured survey with a tape, rod, and level of the building, where each elevation plan is made, inch by inch measurement is done. The modern measuring techniques such as photogrammetry is also used, and that is the use of aerial photograph to make clear maps and surveys, and stereophotogrammetry are also used today to increase the accuracy of our documentation of historical monuments. Once the measurements are complete, there is an analysis of the structural stability of the building and its living pattern of movement. No building is permanently still, because the soil and wind can affect building stability, and that need to be checked and documented by the conservator or a construction engineer or an architect. Finally, the tests were undertaken for the electrical connections, plumbing, and other utilities present in the building. For historic buildings, the lighting, conductors, and firefighting equipment are checked also for the safety. And at the end of this assessment process, the conservator analyzes the data and decide on a conservation plan, that whether the structure requires conservation, restoration, or preservation, or a rebuilding, or a reconstruction. So this strategy is decided after the conservation assessments or architectural conservation assessments. Let's go ahead. Then there are architectural conservation treatments. What are architectural conservation treatments? The architectural conservation treatments covers a wide span of activities, from the cleaning of the interior or exterior of a building to rebuilding of damaged or derelict parts. Buildings are structures which have from time to time particular purposes, and these purposes changes over the period of time. So whether a building require ongoing maintenance to prevent them falling into despair as a result of ravages of time and use. So cleaning of the building, improving in the structure, coloring of the building, and there are so many other treatments that are done. The treatment in the activities include regular maintenance to retain the building from demolition or reconstruction or dilapidation. Not all building conservation seeks to follow the original design of the building, because over the period of time, as people use building, they make changes in the building. And sometimes these changes are more important for the functionality of the building. It is reasonably quite common for the shell of a building or its external walls to be retained, while an entirely new building is constructed within. And this approach is also referred to as the adaptive reuse of the building or structure. And commonly, it is nowadays very common across Europe and America, as well as in other countries, that architectural conservation is mostly become an adaptive reuse exercise. Although techniques of architectural conservation are improving, the action of cleaning or repairing building can be seen to cause an unforeseen problems. For example, the sandblasting that is done to the stone to clean the smog deposit from soft stone buildings, the damaged external face of the stonework to extent that later the stonework needed to be replaced. So sandblasting, which is basically there to improve the facade or make the building more clean, sometimes cause unforeseen damage and the elevation need to be removed. So very care is required while construction of the conservation or while architectural conservation treatment, a care should be given, a focus should be given to architectural conservation. Now let's look at the international and local organizations that promote architectural conservation. There are many organizations that work to raise public awareness of the necessity to preserve ancient and historic buildings and areas across communities, across users, and across governments. In addition to promoting the cultural value of these historic buildings and encouraging appropriate policies and strategies for conservation, the organizations can help in raising the required funding to implement conservation initiatives and plans. So there are also international organizations that help conserve and restore your building in your country, and they are international organization just to support the architectural character of those buildings which are having a high architectural character or value. They often serve as the link between the community and local federal governments to advance conservation projects. Because governments have their own agendas in working and for the welfare of the people. And people have a sense of belongingness to different places and spaces. So there should be an integration between these places. For example, I can tell you that in Mohenjo-daro, the people have so much sense of belongingness to the place, but as government do not have resources, so they cannot conserve or preserve the old structures. Then they require international help, and international help is always there if we wanted to take it into consideration. The Institute, for example, the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, or IHBC, is the UK's professional body for historic environment conservation specialists. IHBC work in the areas that help secure conservation of historic places, buildings, sites, and areas. So they can be contacted for different conservation or architectural conservation projects. Then there is an International Council on the Monuments and Sites known as ICOMOS. ICOMOS is a professional association that works for the conservation and protection of cultural heritage places around the world. Then we have a UNESCO World Heritage Center. This works for internationally with offices all around the world for the cultural heritage or the world heritage around the world. Then in local context, we have a heritage cell at Department of Architecture and Planning, NLD University of Engineering and Technology, Karachi, Sindh, where we have done so many heritage activities. For example, the documentation of the heritage buildings in Karachi. These documentations were taking place in our department for the restoration and conservation of the historic monuments in the city. And there are so many buildings identified in the city for the protection. Then the issue of conservation and restoration of cultural heritage is very significant. Not only for us, but internationally, it is a very important factor. The conservation and restoration of cultural heritage focuses on protection and care of tangible cultural heritage, including the artworks, the architecture, the archaeology, and museum collections. The conservation activities include the preventive conservation, examination, documentation, research, treatment, and education. The care of cultural heritage primarily aimed at fixing and mending objects for their continued use and aesthetic enjoyment. The conservation of cultural heritage as a distinct field of study initially developed in Germany due to adverse effects of World War II that have destroyed most of their cities and the buildings. Internationally, there are various cultural heritage character charters or documents that are developed for the protection of cultural monuments. These include 1931 Athens Charter, sponsored by International Congress of Architects and Technicians of Historic Monuments, the Venice Charter of 1964. It was developed in the Second International Congress of Architects and Technicians of Historic Monuments. Then in 1972, there is a Stockholm Declaration by the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, and then there is European Charter of Architectural Heritage of 1975 by the Council of Europe, and then there is a Bura Charter of 1981 by the ICOMOS, and finally in 2003 there is Paris recommendations by the 32nd UNESCO Convention on Architectural Conservation and Preservation of the Heritage, or tangible and intangible heritage. So these are the international cultural heritage documents. Apart from them, there are also some other documents whose list is not significant to be mentioned here, but there are also so many other documents which are internationally treaties or international recognition of this domain of knowledge of architectural conservation and preservation. Well, in these charters and principles, they establish for the architectural conservation and restoration of cultural heritage. And it has direct impact on construction practices in terms of newfangled techniques and skillful labor-intensive work which is required due to these conventions or due to these charters. So now finally, let's look at a case study of architectural conservation. Now, this case study, which you are going to see, is a refurbishment of community facilities in a cathedral in the city of Porto in Portugal. Now, this is a restoration and extension project in Oporto, Portugal. Here you see the location of the cathedral, Porto Cathedral of the city. And here is the zoom in view. In this project of restoration and extension of Porto, Portugal, there are different, you can say, techniques used of architectural conservation. The site is located in the city center of the Porto city. The red area mentioned or marked is showing the site and extension of the building. And the Porto Cathedral is a place of a tourist attraction. This is the location plan of the place, and this is the site plan. Now this is the master plan, or you can say the site plan of the project. Here is the site. So this is the location of the project where the extension and conservation took place. And same you can see in the satellite image. The site plan shows that a very small portion of the cathedral was allowed to have extension with community facilities because the demands on the building like the Cathedral of Porto nowadays go well beyond the religious worship. There are visitors, tourists, groups of tourists, cultural activities, and many more things that is happening. The backing to all this, there was an issue of logistics or needs for the cathedral which were either non-existent or exist in a very confusion of these spaces. So therefore, this was required, this project was required. This is the north point, it is mentioned. Now, this is the cathedral restoration extension project. The main thing was that the requirement. The architect was given this site that this is the part of the place where he can intervene. And he was asked to do different things. The architect was asked to provide logistics and resolve the issues of the facilities to tackle with the increasing visitors and tourists to this building. The requirement of the project include an administrative space to be used for the management, a meeting space for all the members of the cathedral, a space for the officials and guards, a living space, a space for processes of cleaning, maintenance, and care of clothing, objects, and ornaments, and service toilets. So these were the main requirements that are to be fixed in this small space. Furthermore, the location for all these facilities to be kept within the confines of the rundown area at the backyard which was the main difficulty of the project because the front yard or front places were occupied and all the construction work has to be done at the back of the building, and that building back of the building was surrounded by other structures. So here comes the specialty or the impact for the construction engineers to be intelligent enough to deal with the situation. So main difficulty of the project was the backyard rundown area, which was already in a dilapidated condition. The project architect, uh, her name is architect Angela Mello. She discussed the requirements with the people working and living in the cathedral and discussed the issues with the archaeologists, construction engineers, and other professionals and how to execute a project inside this. And first of all, how to design it and what to design it. So after discussion on the plan of extension was prepared, it is a ground plus one story extension that was proposed by the architect. And here you can see the ground floor plan where you have a public space, and the first floor plan where you have the private space. So public and private domain were distributed in this first instance. Furthermore, here you can see the proposed extension in the project was most with more modern technology and materials. And you can clearly identify the distinction of the extension area and the historical building. The historical area is on the right of the building and the new structure is on the left. So you can also see the shape geometry is also different. Here you see another section, section A and section BB, where you find that the architectural style is changed in both the new extension and the old architecture. They have different styles. So this is one of the important aspects. The proposed extension in the project was made with most modern materials and technology. The reason for which was the clear distinction between the old structure which was restored and new structure as it was developed in tight backyard or backyard, which were the structure was not visible from the main streets and not accessible also. So, but internally the users were facilitated. The old stone structure remained intact and their historical character was not disturbed visually or otherwise in any manner whatsoever. Furthermore, you can see these sectional elevations as visible from section AA and section BB, that front elevation has same old character architectural style and materials as well as the shape geometry with arches and gable roof, but the internal extension was developed with the modernist horizontal and vertical lines. The earthen materials and color were used so as the extension shall be harmonized with the old structure. Here you can see the visuals of the extension. The cathedral building is an old stone building with surrounding old structures of stone construction. In the refurbishment project, the use of glass, wood, and RCC is quite significantly evident, with horizontal roof extension providing the shade to the old structure. The rough old surfaces were also maintained and internal surfaces had the smooth texture, material, and colors with a contrast with the old structure. Whereas if you look at the external surfaces of the project, you can find that the external texture and materials will also in contrast with the old structure to distinguish the architectural features with wooden panels, door windows frames and glass windows. The stone texture of old building was maintained and windows were made in total contrast as the iron grille of old structure and modern wooden windows are quite visible in the structure. In circulation corridors, the old floor tile work was also repaired and new CC tiles were installed. Furthermore, if you look at the external surfaces, you find that the wooden texture of external surfaces of extension structure and old stone texture of cathedral building and retaining old flooring depict a unique distinctive character of old and new in harmony and as well as innovative design with the provision of the lighting and slits that are very important for the visual you can say appealing of the building elevations. Furthermore, if you are going ahead inside the building, you find that this internal spatial arrangement has artificial as well as natural light arrangement. The spatial design is evident in false ceilings, stone walls, and marble flooring, which dominates the overall ambience with earthen colors. And that is quite evident in these visuals. Furthermore, if you look at the interior spaces, you find that the earthen colors of white, brown, and gray stone creates a monochromatic color scheme. And this monochromatic color schemes create a calm and soothing environment inside the public and the private domain and spaces. The smooth, hard, and textured surfaces creates an integration of old and new architecture in terms of material contrast as well as the spatial arrangement. Furthermore, if you look at the building from inside, you find that the circulation spaces such as staircase spaces develop with proper arrangement of artificial lighting, wooden tread and risers, and stainless steel handrails. The light colors such as white and light brown in a staircase make it more bright and as wide space visually. Furthermore, you can see the details further. You find that the artificial lighting is also focused in the interior spaces with the use of glass ventilators at strategic points in the north and with respect to sun direction and movement of sun throughout the day. The corridor and circulation spaces are also designed by considering human ergonomics and comfortable movement of people and use of space. Furthermore, if you look at these visuals, you find that the creation of white space is a specialty or a special character in the building. Inside the built structure, white space is especially focused, and that is another significant contribution as evident in the interior design and decoration of this extension project. The washing spaces, bathrooms, and powder room are well ventilated with natural light and standard circulation. The full height windows in rooms were designed to take full advantage of the sunlight, and daylight factors were also taken into consideration. Furthermore, if you look at the interior environment, you find that there are special construction features and the design of the false ceiling, in the design of the floors, in the design of walls of interior space, and the interior spatial design. There are many interesting internal and external views which were developed to have very nice internal and external environment with the structures and within the structures. The furniture layout and interior design also depict a classy look and efficient, comfortable circulation. Thus, it is quite evident from this cathedral restoration and extension project that if architect and construction engineer work together with harmony, the architectural restoration and building conservation project creates a very good impact of environment and ambience on the users and visitors of this place. With this statement, I end my lecture because time is too much. Finally, I must acknowledge the references for architectural restoration and conservation and its impact on construction. There are different books and you can say reference books as well as the articles that are given in this slide for the reference of students. And I also encourage you to please look at these. These are available online as I read from them and present the lecture to you. You can also read from them and learn for you by yourself. So wish you good luck. Thank you very much for the listening to this lecture, and I hope to see you in the next class. And thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck.